This is economics lecture number 8 on profit maximization. Let's learn some economics. Okay, now profit maximization is a very simple thing to understand, and we're going to have some fun with it. This is really where we can start putting the various balls in motion that we've been discussing, particularly in the last lecture, with costs. Now, as I've said before, let's start this off as simply as possible. Okay, money can flow in two directions. Money can flow in, money can flow out. Okay? Well, the money that flows in economics we refer to as revenue. The money that flows out we refer to as cost. The last lecture we discussed at great length the various costs, how costs work. Okay? We review here and remember that revenue is price times quantity. Okay? We can remember a lot of things from cost as well. Like, for example, my total cost is my fixed cost plus my variable cost in the short run. In the long run, there is no fixed cost. Everything is variable, etc. Okay? Now, there are basically two methods of determining the profit maximizing level of output. Okay? And they both get you to the same place. It doesn't matter which of them you select. We're going to learn both of them. And they both get you to the same place. The first way to determine it is based on output. Money in per unit of output versus money out per unit of output. Well, when we think about the money in per unit of output, what are we talking about? Well, I mentioned this briefly in the last lecture. Money in per unit is really price, but we can think of it as marginal revenue. Now, what we're going to learn when we look at the different types of markets is that price and marginal revenue are the same thing, only in a perfectly competitive market. In any other market, marginal revenue and price are a little bit different. We'll go over it when we get to those different types of markets, why that's the case. So ultimately what we're dealing with is money in per unit, which is marginal revenue, which is the change in total revenue as the result of a 1 unit increase in quantity, and money out per unit, which is what we were talking about in the last lecture, marginal cost, which is the change in total cost consequential to a 1 unit change in output. Okay, so money in per unit of output, money out per unit of output. That's the one way to look at it, and we'll look at that. The other way to look at it is to do it based on unit of input. Okay, money in per unit of input, money out per unit of input. Now, let's think about that just for a second. We'll rest here and just think about that for a second. What do we mean money in per unit of input? Well, what did we talk about? We talked about marginal quantity, okay, the amount that each worker produces, okay? Well, marginal quantity times the price of the unit is going to be money in per unit of resource. So, for example, if I'm working somewhere and I make 10 units of whatever it is we're making, and they charge $2 per unit, I've brought in $20 of revenue. See what I'm saying? Okay? So marginal quantity times the price is going to be the money in per unit of resource. The money out per unit of resource, in a simplified model, is the wage. So again, let's say that I'm producing 10 units. The company gets, or we get $2 per unit. That's $20 in. Let's say my wage is $15. That's money out per unit of input. So you have money in per unit of input, money out per unit of input. In that case, and so we can look at this now and just kind of to review. Let's look at the first method. Money in per unit of output, money out per unit of output. Let's say that money in per unit of output, let's say the marginal revenue for this product is $10. Okay? And let's say money out per unit of output, per unit of input, or per unit of output rather, money out per unit of output, the marginal cost, let's say, is $6. Okay, well, we've said the marginal revenue, money in per unit of output, is $10. Marginal cost, money out per unit of input, per unit of output, is $6. So you have $4 in profit per unit. Simple enough. Okay, same thing for units of input. In that last example, I was making 10 units at $2 a unit. That's $20 in per unit of input. My wage is $15. That's $15 out per unit of input. so we make $5 per unit of input. Okay, now let's look at how these two things work. And I had mentioned this earlier. Remember, this here is our marginal cost curve. This is nothing unfamiliar to us. We saw this in the last lecture. As we begin to produce, we face our highest marginal cost. Because of specialization of function, we develop an economy of scale. We drop down to this minimal point, the point of capital saturation. Then marginal cost starts to rise. Well, if we superimpose the marginal revenue on this, the price of the product, in a perfectly competitive market, it becomes fixed. It's a straight line across. Everything up here, okay, is marginal cost greater than marginal revenue, which means if marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, what does that mean? That means more money is going out per unit of output than is coming in per unit of output, which means you're losing money. Down here, marginal revenue, okay, this line here, is greater than marginal cost. So money in per unit of output is greater than money out per unit of output, and so you're making a profit. Now, the idea is to maximize this profit. Well, in order to maximize this profit, we've got to pay very close attention to this, because this is the most common mistake made by introductory level economics students. Okay? When we first start out, and we'll see this as we go through this in a little bit more detail when we bring in cost curves and things like that to this, we're actually losing money per unit. Okay? And so students will say, oh, well, then you can't produce, because if you're losing money per unit, you're actually running at a negative profit. You're actually operating at a loss, so you should just not produce. Well, let's take another look at this. I expect to make less money per unit of output than I send out per unit of output because of diminishing marginal returns, because as we specialize in function, the marginal cost is going to drop. Okay, so we actually want to produce here. Now, here's the second mistake that's commonly made is, oh, okay, well, we'll continue to produce until we maximize the distance between money in per unit of output and money out per unit of output. So that's this point of capital saturation. Well, again, let's take a look at that graphically, and it really does help to look at this graphically. Let's look at this graphically. If we stop producing here, what does that mean? Granted, we've reached the point where we have maximized money in per unit as opposed to money out per unit. That's the greatest distance between them. But look at what we're losing out on. We want to capture. We would lose all of this space. We want to capture all of this space. So in point of fact, we'll continue to produce until we reach a point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Okay? Now, when you say that to students, they don't keep in mind the graph. Okay, and so they say, oh, well, marginal revenue and marginal cost, and you'll see this. Marginal revenue and marginal cost will cross twice. The marginal cost curve will cross marginal revenue on two occasions. When we first start to produce, it will cross it here. As we continue to produce, it will cross it again here. And students say, oh, okay, well, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's right here. This is a lack of understanding of the graph. Okay, so let's look at this. If we stop producing here, we actually make no profit at all, right? We would stop at this number of units, at this amount of labor, at this amount of product, whatever. We would stop right here, and we would sacrifice all of this profit. So instead, we want to run down, get to the point of capital saturation, then run up. And so actually, one of the general rules of thumb that you can pay attention to as we're working through problems and things like that, your point of profit maximization is always going to be beyond your point of capital saturation. The only time it will not be that is when marginal cost and marginal revenue are exactly the same at the low point of marginal revenue. Okay? And that's just the first cut at this. So keep this graph in mind. It's a critical graph to pay attention to. Okay? All right, now let's look at an example. This example is drawn from the running example that we've been using for the class and from the last lecture, our restaurant example. Okay, and you'll see this is exactly what we've been looking at. Let's suppose that we're paying our workers $7.80 an hour. Okay, and we'll look at the cost table to see how we look at this from the table as well. Exactly as we just saw, and what we should be very familiar with as we begin to produce. Marginal cost is at its highest level. That marginal cost gradually reduces as a result of specialization of function. You see it crosses. This is our marginal revenue right here. $7.80 per meal is our average, or at least that's what we're saying for this example. Okay, so you see, as we said before, it's going to cross, marginal revenue is going to cross that marginal cost curve twice. You see up here, marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, which means you're losing money per unit. Cost is greater than revenue per unit of output, which means you're losing money. Down here, we start to gain money. Money out per unit of output is less than money in per unit of output, so we gain all this, and this is then our profit area. We'll continue to produce. You see here at the seventh laborer, that's our low point. That's the greatest distance between the money in per unit and the money out per unit. But that's not where we want to stop producing, as I just said. We want to continue to produce until we reach a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, one of the things we're going to look at as we go through this, and this is one of the things actually that kind of bothers me with economics textbooks. It's always an idealized model, isn't it? It's always perfect, right? The question, of course, comes up. All right, what if it wasn't there? What if instead it was right here and the next worker was right here? Okay, this worker, marginal cost was lower than marginal revenue. This worker, marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue. In that case, you want to stop production here. You want to stop production as close to this point as you can. That's why I modify it over here. Marginal revenue greater than or equal to marginal cost. That puts us in this area. Once we get into this area, marginal cost isn't going to come down again. We're just operating at a loss. Okay? Now let's look at our cost table. Okay, and we'll look now. This is calculated with wage per worker of $9 an hour and the ingredients for a meal of $6. Okay, that's how I've calculated marginal cost here. And this is where we can start to play with some of the variables. All right, what we'll play with right now, and we'll see ultimately how this is used to derive the supply schedule. This is ultimately telling us how the supply schedule, when we dealt with utility maximization, we saw ultimately the derivation of a demand schedule and why the demand schedule is downsloping. Now we're going to look at a supply schedule and why it's upsloping. Okay? We start off with our marginal cost. Marginal cost gradually drops. Now, if we charge price of $7.80 a unit, we continue to produce. We see that here's the 2 points, right here and right here. Okay, think it through. Look at the graph. Picture the graph in your mind. All right? Here's the 2 points. And what students will say is, okay, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. There you go. There's my profit maximizing level. Come on. Look at it. Think it through. Okay, this laborer is losing me money per unit of output, aren't they? It's costing me $16.50. I'm making $7.80. They're losing me money. These guys are losing me money. This is my first break-even person. Okay, as we continue to specialize, look, worker 4, worker 5, worker 6, worker 7, worker 8, all making me money. You see that it's diminishing marginal returns after this worker. Now, we could look at this. One of the practices, one of the things I suggested is, just by looking at this table, you should be able to tell me where the point of capital saturation is. Where's the low point? Either 1, where's the high point in marginal quantity, or 2, where's the low point in marginal cost? Well, the low point in marginal cost is right here at our 7th worker. Okay? But we don't want to stop producing then, because look, if we stop producing here, this next worker, okay, producing 10 units, the difference in total quantity, producing 10 units is making me 90 cents per unit. Okay? Money in per unit, money out per unit. They're making me 90 cents per unit. If I stop right here, I've just sacrificed $9 in profit. Okay? And you know, I can't afford to sacrifice $9 in profit. I got a kid, maybe two kids going to Robert Morris at this point. Robert Morris is expensive school. Okay, that's what you get when you go to an elite school. It's expensive. So I need all the profit I can get. So I'm going to keep producing till this ninth work. All right? Simple enough. Now what we can play with this, and we will, with some problems is, what if we charged, I don't know, what if we charged $7 a meal? Okay, and this is what I was talking about. What you're really interested in, because the economics world in the classroom doesn't work the same way the economics world does in reality. It's not as even and smooth and idealized. What if instead of $7.80 per meal, we charge $7? Okay, well, it's the same thinking. But now look at these two guys. Worker 8 is producing for $6.90 a unit, and now we're charging $7. So they're making me a dime per unit. Okay, which means for the 10 units they produce, that's a total of a dollar in profit. Doesn't seem like much, but a dollar's a dollar. That's my friend Mark Grodlinski used to say in graduate school. We would play John Madden NFL football on PlayStation, right? That's how long ago it was. But, you know, we'd pick up a yard, and it's like, hey, a yard is a yard is a yard. You know, it's something. This worker, however, do we hire them? Okay? This is that condition we looked at where one of the workers was in the area of marginal revenue greater than marginal cost. The next worker was marginal revenue greater than marginal cost. Well, no, we're not going to hire him. Okay? Because he's taken away $7.80 and now we've dropped the price. And we could drop the price. I could say, what happens if we drop the price to $6.75? Well, then we'd stop hiring here. Okay? You notice as we drop the price, the distance between marginal cost, money out per unit, and money in per unit shrinks. Okay? If we increased price, say we increase price to $10.50, now we can hire this 10th worker. This is kind of one of the implications of this, one of the ancillary implications of this, is that inflation is not always a bad thing. Okay? Inflation is, by definition, a rise in prices. Well, if prices are rising, okay, we can end up hiring another worker. That's, if you remember from the last lecture, I explained the Phillips curve. This gets to a little bit more microeconomic explanation of why the Phillips curve is the way it is. If inflation happens and we have a rise in price, therefore a rise in marginal revenue, we can actually hire more workers and unemployment will go down. Okay, just kind of a basic thing. Here's our profit. I've calculated profit for us. Profit is simply revenue minus total cost. Okay, so you can see where we get these numbers. Negative 1740, negative 21, negative 21, negative 1560, negative 660. Now, I want to rest here just for a second, and we're going to explain this again. And again, I need you to think this through. It's not enough to memorize tables and formulas and things like that. You've got to think. Think logically, because it actually makes a lot of sense, and it's actually not that difficult. If you recall from our previous lecture, lecture 7, throughout that lecture we had a fixed cost of $12. Now what that meant was that whether or not we operate our restaurant, whether or not we operate our means of production, we have to pay out $12 an hour. Remember we talked about Goodfellas and Ray Liotta and Pay Me, right? Okay, so you got to pay out $12, okay? No matter what, whether you operate or not. Well, if this is our best point, okay, minus 660, if we end up with a profit of negative 660, we'll continue to operate. Why? For the very simple point. It's better to eat negative 660 an hour than it is to eat negative 12 an hour. Okay? Simple enough? If profit is greater than my fixed cost, then I'm going to continue to operate. We'll deal with that in more detail later. Now, here's the second method of determining profit maximization. And then we'll look at examples of it. Okay? But here's the basic second method. All right. We call this MRP. This is marginal revenue produced. This is money in. This is the amount of money that each unit of a variable resource, that's what VR stands for here, money in per unit of variable resource. Okay? What we talked about at the beginning of this lecture was every worker produces so many units. This is what we get from marginal quantity. What we get from diminishing marginal returns is what? That each unit will produce more than the preceding unit till you reach some point, the point of capital saturation. After that, each unit will produce less, blah, 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 blah. Okay, all good. We understand that. We've learned that now, okay? Multiply that by the price, marginal quantity times price, and that's how much money's being brought in by each worker. And this basically, the simple way of thinking about this one is you have to pay for yourself, okay? A worker is only valuable to me if they can pay for themselves, if they bring in as much as they're taking away. Okay? If they're bringing in $10 an hour and taking away $15 an hour, they're losing me $5 every hour. Okay? What we're going to see is just exactly the same thing as we saw with marginal cost. There's going to be a point where this is going to, well, you know what? I'll deal with that when we get to the example. We'll deal with that when we get to the example. Okay, if the price of the product is greater than $1, the MRP curve will be above the marginal quantity curve, and if the price is less than $1, the marginal revenue product will be below marginal quantity. Okay. Now, just kind of as an aside of the two methods, I kind of prefer this method, and the reason I prefer this method is it seems easier to me. I can kind of actually do it most of the time in my head because to figure out MRP, to figure out the marginal revenue produced, you just simply multiply marginal quantity times price. Okay? And then if you have a fairly stable price for your variable resources, such as a uniform wage for labor, it becomes easier to figure it out. Whereas with marginal cost, you're doing a division. Okay? You're dividing the change in the total cost by one more unit of output. So you're dealing with division. This deals with simple multiplication. It really doesn't matter which method you use. We're gonna look at both. We're gonna learn both. It really doesn't matter which method you use. It's largely because they're both gonna get you to the same point. Okay. Now here's what marginal revenue produced is going to look like, and you see what we learned in the last lecture is that the MRP, the marginal revenue product, okay, is the mirror image of marginal cost. Remember, just before in this lecture, we had the marginal cost curve that bowed downward like this and then came back up. Well, MRP is going to be the same thing. Production per unit of input is going to go up, okay, per worker. Each unit produces more than the preceding unit until we reach some point, our point of capital saturation. Thereafter, each unit is going to produce less than the preceding unit. Okay? You see again, now, what we've changed here, always what we're looking for is money in versus money out. In this case, when we had marginal cost, that marginal cost curve was money out per unit of output. This we had as marginal revenue, which was money in per unit of output. Here we kind of reverse that. It's a mirror image, okay? This is money in per unit of input. This is money out per unit of input, okay? So we have very similar things. Now, here's what we see here is this relationship I talked about in the preceding slide. Here we have marginal quantity, okay? The amount produced by each unit of a variable input. And here we have MRP. You see that they're simply multiplicative of each other. That's why I say marginal quantity times the price of the product. And that's why I said in the last slide, if the price is greater than 1, the MRP curve is going to be above the MQ curve. If the price is less than 1, it will be below it. Okay? So if the price of our product, not that any prices are like this, is 10 cents, and we produce 100 units, my MRP is going to be $10. So I'm going to produce 100 units, but we're only going to get $10. Okay? Doesn't happen very often. Doesn't happen very often because the price of products, by the time they finally get to market, is very rarely under $1. Okay, simple enough. Now, here's a simple model of what we've been talking about. Let's say we have a stable wage rate. We pay all of our workers $12 an hour. Okay. Here's the MRP in terms of product. The first worker comes in, and I don't have MQ here, but we can kind of figure out what it is. Based on the price, the MRP goes up, reaches some maximum point. Again, I should be able to tell immediately where the point of capital saturation is. How do I tell immediately where the point of capital saturation is? Look for the high point. There's capital saturation. Okay. We look here, we can see it in the table. It's at the sixth worker, $36. Okay. We notice that this is the maximum distance. Now, again, this is similar to the mistake that is often made with the first method of profit maximization. We see that marginal revenue produced crosses the wage rate, crosses the price of inputs at two levels, here and here. Okay, and I am a good student, and I learn the rule. I learn that MRP greater than, or MRP equals the price of the variable resource. Okay, and so I say, oh, okay, well, here we have MRP is equal to price of the variable resource, so I'll stop producing here. Again, this shows a lack of understanding. What you're doing is you're denying yourself any profit at all. We have to continue to produce until some point after the point of capital saturation. We continue to produce until the second time it crosses that line. And it will always cross that line again. This is a stable flat line, the price of labor. Okay? We're going to see that even when it's not exactly a stable flat line, it's still going to cross again. Why? Because of diminishing marginal returns. Diminishing marginal returns says that after that point of capital saturation, this is going to be a negative slope. Eventually, it will get into negative numbers. Okay? Now, we're gonna expand that model a little bit, and economic textbooks really don't do this because they keep very simplified models, and I can understand that. I can understand the interest in doing that. But we don't lose that much clarity in expanding the model to be a little bit more accurate. When we deal with the production of something, very rarely is labor the only variable resource cost that we face. We usually face other variable resource costs. In the case of our restaurant example, for example, the additional variable resource cost that we face is the ingredients of a meal. Okay? Well, that's going to fluctuate more. If we have a nice, stable, standard wage rate for our workers, for that variable resource, that would be a flat line. Okay? The same regardless. It's about as close as a variable resource will get to being fixed, is if we have one wage rate for everybody. But what if, but see, they come in and they start producing, and as they produce, they're using more variable resources to produce. Okay? And so that's going to start to bow up and get closer and closer to MRP. I'll show you an example in just a second. All right? Now here we have our modified model. Remember, we had $12 an hour was our standard wage rate, okay, right here. And it cut like this. Well, now we've changed that a little bit. We've changed it because we've added additional variable resources. Okay? And so our marginal variable cost is now going to go up. Okay, as we see to this top point. And then it's going to drop down again. What this is going to end up doing then is cutting into our profits. All right? And we'll look at that again and again. Here's our first example. Now, this is drawn from the restaurant example that we've been using throughout. Okay? There's our MRP, marginal revenue produced. And we're calculating this at $7.80 per meal. And we're calculating this at $6 worth of ingredients plus a $9 wage rate. Okay? Well, if you remember, and I can just kind of remember off the top of my head, in that costs table, we started off with worker 1 producing a marginal quantity of 2 units. Well, that's $15.60 in, right? $2, $7.80 each. Or rather, 2 units at $7.80 each. They bring in $15.60. But look, they take away $21. We have the 2 units they produced, each of which have $6 worth of ingredients, $6 of other variable inputs into them. Well, that's $12. Plus their wage rate of $9, that's $21. So this guy's losing me $5.40. Next person, they're also operating at a loss, okay, at this second worker. Third worker is breaking even. That's this point right here. All right? We continue to produce, and once we get past that guy, we continue to produce, and you'll notice that now each worker is making me a profit. We max out at the 7th worker here. That's our point of capital saturation. We then begin to drop down again until we get to the 9th worker. If you'll recall, from the first method we used, which was based on marginal cost, we got to the same point. Okay, it was $7.80 out per unit of output, $7.80 in per unit of output. Now we're dealing with $39 in per unit of a variable resource, $39 out per unit of a variable resource. Gets you to the same point. Okay, it's the same balance of money in versus money out. This area here, okay, that's where marginal revenue produced is going to be greater than our marginal variable cost. So money in greater than money out. This is going to be our profit. Down here, this is a loss, right, where money in is less than money out. And over here, money in is less than money out. All right? Now, let's look at some examples of this, and we'll use our restaurant example. If you'll recall, this is kind of a truncated version of that original cost table that we looked at. We actually looked at this. I introduced this for the first time back in lecture 7. Okay? This was our marginal cost. You see that for nobody, we face a marginal cost of nothing. That means there's no change in total cost, right? All right, we continue to work. We continue. Our bottom point was 660. This is the same exact cost table we used before. If you've printed out the PowerPoint, you can confirm that for yourself to your heart's content. All right. Now, let's suppose we start off with a price per meal, a price per unit of $6.75. All right. We see over here in the graph and over here in the table that it's $6.75. All of this is losing me money per unit till I hit here, right? That's that point right there. Then my next worker makes me 15 cents a unit. Before I get to the next worker, you see, I'm losing, I start to lose money. So this worker is in that point. This guy, this unit of a variable input, this laborer is making me money. This laborer is not. And so we're not going to hire this guy. We're only going to hire right here, which means we're going to sacrifice this little itty bitty area of profit, but we're also getting rid of this larger area from here to here of loss. Okay, that's why we're going to do that. Okay, when we raise the price up, and this is actually as simple as it looks to do. Okay, it's not that difficult. You're not splitting the atom here. All right. We raise the price to $7.50. We go down here. We see, okay, it's $7.50. This guy starts making me money. Okay. So now we're down at this level. That's my 4th worker. All right. They start making me money. They continue to make me money. He's making me money. This guy's costing me money. So I'm not going to hire my 9th worker, which is an output of 70. I'm not going to produce 70. I'm right here. Okay. Again, we'll hire this one, but not this one. If we hire this one, we sacrifice this tiny area, but we avoid the loss in this entire area here. And we go to $8, right? We continue to hire as long as marginal cost is less than marginal revenue. Okay? For us to hire this 10th worker, we would actually have to bring it all the way to $10.50, which would be right here. Okay? Here I have $10.75, but bring it up to $10.50. Okay? And so you see what this is this is a change in price. And this is the value. There's a couple of implications from this. Okay? Most notably, this is the value that I was talking about before of inflation. If prices go up, you see, we can hire more workers. For $6.75, we can only hire 7 workers. When that price rises to $7.50, we get to hire on an 8th worker. When it raises to $8, we hire on a 9th worker. Okay? And that explains that Phillips curve I showed in the last lecture. During a growth period where production is increasing, unemployment will drop, you'll hire more workers, and inflation will go up. Prices are increasing, workers are being employed. Simple enough to understand? And again, I have just kind of a written explanation of what we just went over. And this is just drawn from marginal cost. Again, we'll go over it again. At $6.75, I'll hire this many. At $7.50, I'll hire this one. You never want to hire a laborer or to employ a unit of variable input if it exceeds marginal cost. And really, if you think about it, it seems a little more complicated, but look at just keep the graph in mind. That's why this is such a critical graph, okay? After you reach the point of capital saturation, after you reach this low point, you don't want to hire on anyone whose marginal cost, money out per unit, is greater than your marginal revenue, money in per unit. Okay? Now, based on this is how we're going to derive a supply curve. What did we just see? We saw that for $6.75, okay, we were able to hire the 7th worker only, okay. Well, that worker's production level, at that point we had a total production of 55, and then we can simply calculate revenue very simply, price times quantity, and then we look at the profit, revenue minus cost. Here, we're losing $33.75. Now, remember what I said to you before. Now we've got to consider for a moment fixed costs. Okay, this means that if we produce that many, if we produce 55 units, we're going to lose $33.75. If we produce 0 units, we lose $12, our fixed cost. If we shut down our facility entirely, I've still got to repay my loan, okay, for all the capital equipment, etc. Okay, so I'm going to face, at the very minimal, that cost of $12 an hour. Well, negative 12 an hour is better than negative 33.75 an hour, and so I'm going to shut the plant down. So at this point, at $6.75, actually, the quantity produced will actually be 0. My revenue will be 0, and my profit will be negative 12. You see what I'm saying? Okay? I get to $7.50. We produce 65 units. The revenue in is 65 times 7.5, $487.50. Revenue minus cost gives me a profit of $13.50 an hour. And so on until I massively increase my price to $10.75. I then hire all 10 workers. I produce 72. I get $774 in revenue. $240 is my profit. Okay. And now now remember, and we're going to bring this up actually when we start to deal with market equilibrium and profit equilibrium, which will be next week. We'll deal with market equilibrium and profit equilibrium. So far, in our discussion of this profit maximization, we haven't even considered demand for our product. Our decision at production in terms of profit maximization so far has been entirely driven by money in versus money out. We haven't considered demand at all. When we move towards the idea of equilibrium, we're going to have to start to consider demand. Okay, because what we know is what's going to be happening to demand as we move up the supply curve from $6.75 to $7.50 to $8 to $10.75. Well, demand is going to be moving down the demand curve. In other words, fewer people are going to demand the product at $10.75 than are going to demand it at $7.50. We'll consider that later. We don't need to consider that right now. Okay, but this shows you why the supply curve is upsloping. Now, this is the MRP greater than or equal to cost method, which we've seen before. Okay, you'll note when our MRP is 675, this is our marginal variable cost. You see how tiny our profit area is. Okay, this is exactly the same profit area that we saw when we used the first method. The first method was based on money in per unit of output and money out per unit of output. And we had a very small profit. In fact, we ended up with a profit of negative 33.75 overall. Okay, that's because we had to calculate all this area. All this area is loss. Okay, and I've truncated this down between 30 and 70 units of production. So you see we have a very small. Now, you can tell just from looking at the graph. Okay, some students, they like graphs. Some students don't like graphs. Me, I like graphs. Because, what is it they say? They say, excuse me, they say, a picture paints 1,000 words. Okay, we can see what's going to happen here. If we increase the price of our product, this blue line, marginal revenue produced, is a function of marginal quantity times price. So if we increase the price of our product, this line is going to go up. That's going to increase my profit. If also, think about how it's derived. If we were to increase marginal quantity per worker, if we were able to get our workers to produce more, okay, that would also raise up the MRP. And we talked a little bit about how you do that, about what the main determinants are in the last lecture. If, for example, they get greater capital, if we give them incentives, etc., etc. Okay? All right. Now, costs and prices. Note that anything that increases our costs will reduce profit. Anything that increases revenue, such as an increase in MQ or P, will increase profit. Okay? Same thing with the other method. Same thing with money in per unit of output and money out per unit of output. Anything that increases our costs is going to reduce our profit. Anything that increases our cost is going to shift our marginal cost curve upwards. Anything that increases revenue, such as an increase in marginal quantity, an increase in marginal quantity would drop the marginal cost curve down. We'll see all this when we deal with profit equilibrium. That's what the lecture on profit equilibrium, that's what we do for the whole thing. We show how these variables are going to play with each other and how it's going to change that profit area. Now, firm and industry. Okay, we want to think the difference between these two. Simple enough to understand. Everything that we've talked about so far, okay, deals with the profit maximizing output and the profit and everything for an individual firm. Okay, a firm by definition is an individual producer of a commodity. The industry is the summation of all of the firms. Okay, so when we talk about our restaurant, that's a firm. When we talk about all restaurants, that's the industry. Okay, and we'll deal with that. I'll touch on that a little bit. I'm not going to go into as much detail as the book does. The book does that, I think, in chapter 11. It talks an awful lot about the distinction between industry and firm. We'll talk about that a little bit. But really, for my money, microeconomics really focuses on the production of the individual firm. We'll look tangentially a little bit at the overall industry. Now, as you've come to expect, we'll end this with a problem. okay, and go through the problem, and we'll see just exactly how easy this is. This is not difficult to do, okay? Suppose we start with a price of 7. What it ends up being, honestly, it ends up being a little bit of a little bit painstaking in doing the calculations in terms of costs. But in terms of determining the level of profit maximization and how much profit you're going to make, it's really not terribly difficult. It's not nearly as painstaking. It requires a little bit more of a conceptual understanding. And what I do is, like all those models that I showed you, all that stuff, all that whole example, I have that in Excel. I just use Excel. And then all you got to do in Excel is change your formulas a little bit to change the variables, and then Excel will do it for you. That's the value of your computer. Okay, so at any rate, suppose we start with a price of $7.50. We determined that our profit maximizing output for a price of $7.50 is going to be 65 units. That's going to make us a profit of $13.50. We just calculated that over the last few slides. We used both methods to calculate that. We used both MRP and marginal cost. Okay? Now, let's start changing the variables, and let's think about this. Okay? Before we start trying to, I know what happens. I know what goes on. We're like, okay, we've got a problem here. We want to solve it. What we immediately begin doing is trying to calculate things. No. The first thing we want to do is think. Think what's going on. What information do I have? What information do I not have? What variables are changing? What variables are not changing? Okay? Through frugal entrepreneurial wizardry, okay, we're able to reduce the variable cost by reducing the price of ingredients in each meal from $6 to $5. Okay? What's that going to change? Well, let's look at method 1. Money in per unit of output versus money out per unit of output. Well, if we drop that cost from $6 per meal to $5 per meal, we're going to be changing our marginal cost. We're going to shift that marginal cost curve downward. That should mean that we're making more profit, right? If we keep the price the same and drop the marginal cost, that should increase the distance between marginal cost, money out per unit, and marginal revenue, money in per unit. Okay? How would this change our profit maximizing output for a price of $7.50? Okay? This change, if we use the other method, marginal revenue produced, is going to reduce that marginal variable cost curve, which will increase the distance between the marginal revenue produced curve and the marginal variable cost curve, again, increasing our profits. So we anticipate an increase in profit here. Okay? Now, here's our solution. By dropping the cost of ingredients, we are reducing marginal cost, which arrives at the new marginal cost table seen here. Okay, you'll notice that this is a different marginal cost table. Marginal cost is dropped across the board. Okay? I think before it was our low point was, do I remember, $6.60 per unit? Well, not surprisingly, it's going to drop by $1. Okay, because we're dropping the ingredients of a meal by $1, so $5.60 per unit. Okay, we're reducing marginal cost, which arrives at the new marginal cost. This means that for $7.50, our old profit maximizing output was 65. But now let's look. For $7.50, we can now hire this worker. This worker is still going to make me 70 cents per unit. Okay, before I through my entrepreneurial wizardry, before I reduced my cost of ingredients, this guy was costing me $7.80 a unit. Because of my brilliance as a manager, my managerial wizardry, okay, I dropped the cost per unit by $1. That means this guy gets a job, okay? And that's why entrepreneurial ability is one of our resources. We consider entrepreneurial ability a resource. It's one that I often blow off incorrectly, probably, because it does matter. The better your manager is, the more they're able to do things like this, okay? And I would just kind of add a footnote to this problem. That drop in the price of ingredients per meal, as a manager, you've got to be really careful how you do that. Okay? Because, like, the guy, this is, I think I mentioned this before, the last restaurant that I worked at, okay, when I hung up my cooking apron, so to speak, this guy decided to do this. Only the way that he reduced his price of ingredients per meal was to cheapen the quality of the ingredients. Instead of, for example, our fish sandwich, instead of using a nice 10-ounce piece of cod, he would go out and buy the cheapest whitefish he could find, which was this like swai fish. I don't know, at Walmart, if you ever buy this stuff, this swai fish, it's a bottom feeder and it tastes like crap. Cod's a bottom feeder, but it actually tastes good. It's succulent and juicy. Swai is just nasty. Okay? Well, the problem is that, yes, he reduced his marginal cost. He reduced his price of ingredients per meal, but he also reduced the quality. And because he reduced the quality, demand for it dropped. And that's one of the reasons he drove the place into bankruptcy. So you got to be a little careful about it. Now, let's derive our new supply curve with cost down. Now, we know this from a while. We go back all the way to, what was it, Lecture 4, where we discussed supply curves and supply shifts. And what we learned there was that cost of production is our main determinant, okay, of supply. It's one of the main determinants of supply, and it's one of the main determinants of shifts in supply. Okay? What we saw was that if we increase costs, the supply curve shifts inward. If we decrease cost, the supply curve shifts outward. Okay? Well, here what we've done is reduce our cost of production by saving ourselves $1 per meal on ingredients. Okay? Well, that's going to shift my supply curve outward. All right? And that's what we saw. If we were to superimpose the other supply curve here, and PowerPoint's kind of limited. I can only put up so many images at once. I'd like to put up all the images. And of course, if you have the PowerPoints printed out in front of you, you can do that. You can rally back to the original supply curve to compare these two. For 675, we produced 55 units. Now that we've dropped our cost for the same 675, we're producing 65 units. Okay? And so we've shifted our supply curve outward to the right. Now, the implications of all this. All right. The reduced cost shifted supply outward, which we just talked about. And one of the implications of this is I never worked. I actually never worked at a franchise restaurant. I always worked at family-owned and operated restaurants. Okay? And there's a reason for that. In family-operated restaurants, they tend to give you more creativity as a cook. So, like, I could come up with stuff. I could make stuff up. I could go out a lot of the places. I would go down to Woolies. I would go to different purveyors and find what's on special there and come up with new dishes about as to how to do that. Okay, and we always have to do that with a mind of cost. This is why restaurateurs that know what they're doing pay very close attention to food costs. Franchises do it in a very systematic way. What a franchise restaurant will do, there are some family-owned restaurants that'll do this as well, but what a franchise restaurant will do, like Applebee's or the Olive Garden, is they have prep cooks. And what those prep cooks will do is they will measure out the ingredients per meal. And like a place like the Olive Garden, how they actually do things, this is why they don't like substitutions. How they actually do things is their prep cooks come in. They measure out all of the ingredients necessary for a particular dish, and they then put that into a plastic bag, a Ziploc plastic baggie. I've seen them, okay? I interviewed once at the Olive Garden and then decided I didn't want the job, okay? And then they put those in their cooler so that when they get an order, the cook goes back, grabs it, and cooks it up, all right? Why do we do that? Because we keep our food costs down. We face then a standardized food cost of ingredients per meal. At family-owned places, they typically don't do that, which is not a good thing, okay? And my boss at the last restaurant was always honest about that. Measure it out, measure it out, measure it out. Keep an eye on how much you're putting in. Because what I would do, what all of us would do, what all the cooks would do is, we'd have buddies come in and we'd hook them up. We'd give them a little bit of extra, if they ordered themselves a hamburger or something, some French fries. We'll give them a few extra fries. We'll give them a little bit more ground beef in the burger. We'll hook them up. We'll make it better for them. Well, the problem is that that's increasing your food cost per meal. That's reducing your profit. Okay? And so you want to pay very close attention to that. Now, the other thing is, with the increased profits, we can do a multitude of things. Okay? We can do wage increases. We could increase our wage because of it. We could drop our price. Okay? If you remember from that last one, because I dropped the ingredients in each meal, I was making more profit. Well, I could sacrifice some of that increase in profit and drop my price. And dropping my price would force my competitors to drop their price. We're going to look at when we look at the different types of markets, this is going to be the argument for why it is. This is going to be the basis of the argument for why it is that in the short run, profits will evaporate. Okay? And it never occurs to workers, by the way. When I'm thinking now back on this example I just gave you of how Patty and I and we would hook up our friends when they came in. What we never realized is when you hook up your friends like that, you're reducing profits. And I don't really give a damn about how much profit my boss is making. I care about how much profit I'm making. Well, when I reduce her profits, when I reduce their profits, I'm reducing the likelihood and the ability of them to give me a wage increase. So I'm actually cutting my own throat. Never occurred to me at the time, but that's the way it works. Okay? Now the question, of course, is given our increased profits, could we now afford to increase the wage of our underpaid and overworked cooks? Could we pay them now $10 an hour? Well, this is simple enough to answer. Adjust your marginal cost curve. Okay? Plunk in, instead of $9 an hour for the cooks, plunk in $10 an hour. Now, at this point, can you afford to give them that wage increase? Okay? You'd lose a little profit, but you would not lose your overall output level. Okay? And that becomes a question with how much of a wage increase can we afford to give someone? And that's, it used to be that labor unions, really all they argued about was better working conditions and wages. Okay? But what happened is they actually increased their wage to the point where, in order to maintain the same profit level, the producer would have to reduce production, which would reduce the number of workers they need. And so while the union would argue successfully for more wages, they would have to have people laid off in order for the business to make more profit. And so unions kind of changed and started arguing instead for job security. They're willing to sacrifice a little bit of the wage increase in order to have job security. Now let's see if we can maintain job security, okay, and increase the wage of our cooks to $10 an hour.